and educators, and we established an umbrella topic that we entitled Owning Up to the Urban. And the topic that we are trying to capture with this lecture series is basically to address, on the one hand side, we have an incredible urbanization process occurring within the next 30 years that is going to be challenged by climate change and economic paradigm shifts, causing growth in a lot of areas on the one hand side and shrinkage in other areas. And we were really looking at what are the emerging strategies that come from the design disciplines. And when we say design, we are not only talking about urban design, but we are also integrating planning, architecture, landscape architecture, and others. And how is the design community addressing these questions and trying to maybe also see opportunities within these quite challenging urban problems that are emerging. So we entitled it Owning Up to the Urban, as a double meaning, owning the fact that we are going to be an urban planet. And in order to do this, we need to own up to the problems and challenges that are coming along with it. And then also owning in the context of having power and being in ownership of specific assets. And Maria is going to talk about this in a couple of seconds. So as I said, we invited a group of designers. And what was interesting about all of these projects is that they carved out new agencies and new agendas for the design of the urban, and did this also partly without assignments that come from planning departments, etc., but because they saw a need of action. And a lot of them are translating those projects into one-to-one prototypes. And we are really excited to have a very diverse of speakers with us in the next weeks. In order to frame the lecture series, we established a series of questions, and Maria will talk us through this.
Thank you, Mona. So yeah, we want to be part of conversations with those who are actually experimenting, exploring, prototyping, building, and bringing their ideas to fruition. And we want to know how they do it. And some of the questions that you see here are in a way sparking some of these conversations. We want to know about their work, how do they find themselves? Are they problem solvers? Are they into critical theory? Is more about enablers? Is more about advocacy? How they define their agency as designers. At the same time, we want to know what it is that they are doing and why it matters. Are they fixing things? Are they healing? Are they empowering others to advance the work? We want to know about the methods, how they do it, how do they work, and everything around how to make things happen. Who are their partners? What are the stakeholders, the coalitions? What are the allies? How do we know? How do we identify some of those ideal collaborators that are gonna steward the project's long way we are gone? At the same time, we are interested in knowing about funding, how these projects come into being. We are in a very different moment in time in which in many cases, we as designers need to also be in the capacities of writing grants, applying for funding, and how that is happening, what that means for our practice as designers today. And last but not least, good design is an incredible piece of research, and we want to know how the projects may be considered replicable, transferable. What can we learn of what we see in particular places as their capacity to repeat, to scale up, and what are the limitations of some of these questions?
Okay, so with this, just a quick overview for everyone who's visiting us today for the first time. There's a lecture series basically every Thursday, except for the lecture by Nada Nafe, who's going to call in from Cairo, and will be a lunch lecture on a Wednesday. We have an amazing group of speakers coming in, so please stay tuned. The lecture series is posted on both of our institutions' website. But let's move forward to the guest speakers for tonight. We have Akoaki here with us, and we are very, very happy to have Jean-Louis Farges and Anya Sirota. I will leave the introduction of our guest speakers tonight to the students, and I want to also quickly thank them. We have how you, Somrita, Deb, Huiting, and Chu Yu with us. It's a mixed group of students from UVA and from Michigan. And again, thousand thanks to Kareem, our teaching assistant who is recording everything. So please take over. The stage is yours.
Hi, I'm Huiting from University of Michigan. It's our honor to have Anya and Jane Lewis in our lecture. And firstly, I will introduce Anya Sirota, and our college from UVA will introduce Jane Lewis. Anya Sirota is an architecture designer, researcher, and educator. Sirota is an associate professor and associate dean at University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, where she also directs the Michigan Architecture Pro Studio. Sirota holds a degree from Harvard Graduate School of Design and a bachelor in modern culture and media from Brown University.
Hello, I'm Deborah, and so John Louis Farges is a designer and cultural curator working at the intersection of art, media, and architecture through intensive fieldwork and collaborative process. He explores techniques for cultural activations at the urban scale. His design and photography have been published and exhibited internationally. Prior to moving to Michigan, John Louis practiced in New York City and Paris. And now please join me as we welcome Anya and John Louis.
Go.
Thank you so much. What a super introduction. And it's pretty fabulous to be part of this conversation. I think Ishan is going to do something magical and set us up in ways. Oh, there we go. Look at that. It's happening. Okay, so we can see that. I guess we're supposed to pin that so we can see it well. Okay. So just very quickly, thank you for including us in this lineup. I think it's pretty amazing to bring together two schools and set up a series of public conversations about what's pertinent, what's pressing, but also to invite us as designers to confess about our processes and to confess about ways that we're trying to move forward and what makes us tick and what motivates us. So very happy to be part of this. So Ishan, it's happening, it's live? Just checking. Okay, great. So Jean-Louis.
Anya.
What's up? This is, Jean-Louis and I have been in practice together for many years, for a decade and a half. And this is our very first lecture together. So thank you for enabling us to try this out.
So Anya, should I give a few words so everybody understand I have a French accent right away? And I work with Anya, as she said, for 10 years. We have been leading this studio, Akoaki, and we are very complementary and we have very different fields. And it's the complementary who makes the studio exciting and successful, I believe.
So, and a quick introduction also of Ishan, who is behind the scenes, and he's driving this, this visualization experiment. So we're at his whim. So sometimes we'll say next, which is the word that I hate most in lectures, but if we could move on and go next, that would be great, and see how this works. Yeah. So now we're hovering in two different environments. And Ishan is making us big and small. So my environment is the interior of a room in Odessa, in a suburban part of Odessa, Ukraine, called Generala Petrova. And it's a Khrushchev era development that I grew up in for a certain amount of years before moving to the US. So this is by way of saying that I'm a post-Soviet and understand some of the complexities of a socialist environment and the kinds of urbanisms it breeds and the kind of utopian discourses associated with that aspiration. And Jean-Louis comes from a very different place.
Yeah, so I'm coming from Paris. I was born in Paris, but I live in the suburb of Paris, and as the opposite of the US, the working class live in the suburb. And this is this picture across the street from my parents' house, where you see the welcoming of the landscape. And so I grew up in this environment, and he brought me some kind of idea about design and urban and landscape, I would say.
So we're going to take the prompts that Mona and Maria introduced very seriously and kind of try to walk through them. And the first thing that we wanted to address is what kind of agency we have as designers and how we interact. And that takes us back a few years to the early parts of our career, where we started out looking for our own opportunities, looking for our own clients, looking for spaces of intervention. And at this point, we considered ourselves instigators more than anything else. We knew how to launch projects and how to work as sort of activist architects in the urban realm. And our interest was very much to seek ways that architecture and interventionist design might make a case for public cultural infrastructure. So if we move on to the next image, these are the kinds of environments that we first started to work in when we moved to the Michigan context. We discovered that there were many landscapes that were either difficult to read, complex to analyze, and certainly fell outside of the possibility of public cultural infrastructure. And yet we saw them as opportunities for intervention. So the image that you see here is from a project called Interrobang that we worked on with students from the preservation course that we taught at the time. And this was at an inflection point in the history of the Packard automotive plant in Detroit. And this is an Albert Kahn industrial site, a kind of famous version of Albert Kahn's work. And it's over a kilometer long, an extensive site that had been abandoned for over 50 years. And one of the reasons it had been underdeveloped was that the owner of the site was unknown at the time. And so when the owner became, when the owner was revealed through a series of unusual events having to do with Banksy making a piece of art in that space, we decided that this was a moment for an inflection point that we could potentially, rather than bringing this site back online as a normative real estate project, we were trying to make a case that this could be a public landscape, that this could be public infrastructure. Did you want to add anything to that, to the setup?
Yeah, it was an early concrete structure where the steel was over scale in the concrete, so there is no demolition possible of the structure, the concrete structure, but all the top floor was steel structure. So the scrapper and people who need to make money on this neighborhood come over and cut a piece of the building and sell it as a piece of metal in the scrap. So the slow demolition of the top floor was very impressive, very in some way dangerous for everybody in the neighborhood. And we decided that because of the unique kind of space known everywhere in the world, because this building is known in Europe, and we wanted to show how it's important to sometime to look at structure as an asset, even if the decay is at this point.
Yeah, so this is an example of attempting to walk into a situation in a pre-legal context. In other words, the space was not a public space, and to make a case for the fact that it could become a public cultural infrastructure should it be treated in a collective, pluralistic, and multiplicitous way rather than solely being traded back into a real estate scenario. So we worked on creating a project that brought the access point of the roof back to code, and then offered a space for collective intervention, a space for an exhibition on the roof of the Packard plant. And if we move on to the next image, this began with a kind of reassessment of the aesthetic and spatial values of a building that had come undone. In the middle of the night, Jean-Louis with a team of students used generators to begin to light the building, to understand its depth and qualities and material aspects, but also to illustrate that this is a kind of monument to capital extraction. Like, it's an accidental, unsolicited monument to capital extraction, and treating that as a space of a collective imaginary was a first step in rendering that explicit. If we move on to the next image, the research aspects of being able to create a project where there is a temporary ephemeral intervention takes us a very long time. So perhaps in this case, to be honest, the preparation for the project was probably 3-4 months in the works. Working with teams of students, wearing safety vests and hard hats, moving through the site, assessing the site, understanding where this could happen, what the messaging would be, what were the ownership models, how did we get here? How did we get to a situation where an industrial site of significant architectural value had come undone to this level, and how had it captured the public imaginary? How did it participate in the cultural projection of images of Detroit? We move on to the next image. And so this involved also a series of public projects, of tours, conversations. You can see very small people. Those are groups of people that are gathering around with our students and our friends and colleagues and partners in the project to work on understanding how to read this landscape and not take it for granted as a piece of failed modernism. We go to the next image. Sean, there's Jean-Louis, maybe you can speak to this.
So one of the arguments of the city to sell the building was how the structure was unstable.
I don't know if it's like some
and
weird,
of course it's pretty dirty and there is a lot of pieces on the ground, but you can see, so we drove with our pickup and we went on the top floor and go down
so they're doing that so they
in the
can get up
building
here.
just to see and
I
to understand what does it mean that the structure is unstable when actually nobody can demolish the building. So we drove down,
and you can see
that's
if you look up on the ramp,
video of this.
Get up high.
It could be very impressive. It's very unique. You don't do that every day in your life. I love this video, of course. And the building was the scene for a lot of techno music, a lot of artists coming. It's a very, very important art. It used to be a very important art scene in Detroit for 4 years.
So the kind of documentation of action for
this is what scares me more is the ice. Because I don't know if it's like some weird, like they've been patching holes with like tires and shit.
Yeah.
So if they patch it and it fills up with ice, you can't really tell.
So they're doing that so they can get up here. That makes sense, right?
And I think, just in case they miss it, because the very first one is on this ramp.
To share from this project is that kind of moment of coming together, the pluralistic moment where the scrappers, the academics, local residents and activists find themselves in the same space. And there's very little actual architectural intervention. There's a bit of furniture, there's a model of a future possibility where multiple actors have imagined a future for the site. But the small acts of, for example, clearing the drain pipe on the roof, which enabled us to wash away the muck and transform the moss that had grown on the roof into a rug. Those are the acts of design that we're keen on exploring and uplifting in scenarios where there's so little capital to invest in contrast to the need, the level of need. So if we move on to the next project, it's of a similar grain, but slightly different. This one is in Chelsea, Michigan. This was our very first project moving to the Michigan area. And we had been sort of traveling around small towns and just discovering the industrial landscape at a different scale than Detroit. And we came upon a recently abandoned factory called Federal Screw Works. So the title itself drew our attention immediately. That was an exciting title. And as we moved through the space, we realized that this factory was being used as a civic commons for teenagers in Chelsea, Michigan. There were all kinds of signs that people were breaking in and spending time in a different way, whether legal or semi-legal or slightly illegal. And so we called the owner of the factory and wanted to know what the plan was for this site. It was quite large. It was embedded in a residential neighborhood. And we discovered that the plan was demolition, that in the future, they were planning to demolish the site and build a dollar store in its place. And so we asked whether or not we could use the site as a space of temporary exploration and experimentation until the date of demolition, which was down the line. And the owner said, yes, it's yours. There were no keys, but there was no problem for us to get in. And so in response to this question of how do we make a case for the preservation of an 120,000 square foot post-industrial site that had recently gone out of commission, we decided to build a pavilion in the center, in the heart of this industrial space, in the boiler room. And the image that you see us hovering over now is the interior of that pavilion space, which we modeled. The aspiration of it was a kind of poor man's light installation, a James Turrell mixed with, a kind of bean experience, but for a very, very small budget. So this is the interior view. And if we go to the next shot, this is the exterior of that pavilion. So it's in the boiler room. It's attempting to grab natural light from the openings in the walls that we created and from the roof, the glass in the roof, and creating an atmosphere that could be surprising or wondrous, despite the aesthetic scenario in which kids in the neighborhood might find themselves in. So, Jean-Louis, did you?
Yes, I want to say that, first of all, the budget for this kind of project when we started to work was very, very small. We had a support of a lot of students working with us, Tolman College, lab, technology. And of course, this picture looks like pretty pleasant, but it's probably 20 degrees. And it's very cold. There is no heat, no water. It's very dirty. So to get this level with so little money, it was a challenge. And the idea was really to have an entrance where you only see the interior red and light of this pavilion, and you cannot see where you are in the building. The only way to see this building, the space where is the pavilion, is to go out, turn around, and come back in this room this way. So that was a very intense project, and I believe he was successful in this goal.
Jean-Louis, I think the next, if we go to the next image, it shows a little bit of the scale of
Right.
this. So this is Jean-Louis standing inside of the pavilion, inside of the boiler room of the Federal Screw Works. And if we go to the next image, it shows the entry. So this is just a crack in the building that's inserted. It's hard to find. There's no signage that tells you that this is where this alternate universe is happening. And in the next image, you can also see, you know, where we're taking people in there, and we've left a box of paper booties so that people could put on these paper socks and not bring the oil from the industrial site into this other alternate universe of an oasis. And, you know, it seems like that's a huge amount of effort to create a singular phenomenological, emotive moment for kids that might be, you know, smoking a joint or experiencing their first kiss or just wandering around an abandoned zone. But for us, this kind of act of intense labor is also about making a case for a civic commons where one should find investment from the common good. So if we move to the next few images, and we can move through these pretty quickly, Ishan, the work of you know, working without electricity, working without heat, working in a context that requires us to reimagine what value is and how to bring value to an under-resourced site. These are all the kinds of questions that we're asking ourselves. And we're bringing performance art from the beginning to a space that normally wouldn't have it, and attempting to make a case that it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile to consider the possible futures through these micro interventions. And even this is an image of Ole Baumann, who ended up coming to this intervention, and it was a nice moment because for us, he's sort of the inventor of this concept of an unsolicited architecture. And at this point, we were practicing what an unsolicited architecture might look like and how to fund it.
And I want to add, Anya, that all this work started from our background and my background from Europe, where we consider the factory and as a working class heritage. And there is an investment in all those buildings in Europe to be preserved and to be used as space for everybody in the community, in the cities. So is really the case, like Anya described it, how you can look at those buildings, you can say they are in decay, but if you invest some money on it, you can really reuse them as a cultural center for everybody in the small city. And that was really the goal of this project. And yes, that was the goal. Yeah.
Yeah, so if we go back to the other, to the last image, just to say that once we create an environment, typically there's a punctuation mark where we attempt to bring people together from different environments, from different contexts and backgrounds, to foster a conversation about the value proposition of investment in a particular place. So in the case of this funny little pavilion, we threw an event that we called Ruin Porn at Federal Screw Works. And this was in collaboration with a drummer, but also a Playboy bunny who had recorded her voice reading ruin porn texts that were then played through the space as a tribute to the reevaluation of aesthetic sensibilities connected to industrial sites. So our final image is just to say from this project, Ishan, if we move forward, is just to say that this pavilion was in place, lodged in this boiler room for 3.5 years, untouched. And the only thing that we did was every so often we would replenish the booties. We would bring a new box of paper booties, and nothing else happened to the site. So for us, this was a kind of case study in collective stewardship over an unsolicited architecture.
And we should have a little word for Stephen as well who work on this project with us.
Yep, absolutely. And this was a project, an early project that we worked on with Stephen Christensen, who now has his own firm in Los Angeles, and is doing amazing work. But this was a, you know, like this was our first project out of school together. Totally. So if we move on. Yeah, so the next series is about the way we think about parallel institutions. You know, once we started to mature out of the pre-legal or the activist mode, we started to recognize that organizing around networks of people, organizing people to act together was a design proposition that was just as important as creating the artifact to speak for a particular political agenda or aesthetic position. So this is where we began to realize that the organization of the governance system or the organization of how things work needs to be aligned in some ways with the artifacts and interventions that we're producing as architects. It started, if we move to the next image, with a project that was born out of the North End in Detroit, which is very close to the city center. At this point, currently, it's the first stop on the Q line, so it's very much in the heart of the redevelopment zone. And it's a legacied African-American historical neighborhood that spawned vanguard cultural activity from the mid 20th century onward. This was the place where Motown musicians, funk musicians, experimental musicians played and participated in vanguard activities at an international scale. And when we started to work there, our question in bringing institutional structures to the foreground of our work was how could we invest and how could we create a cultural infrastructure that would render visible the invisible narratives of place using a minimum budget? And how could those activities bring people together to imagine alternate structures for organizing themselves in the city and in space?
I think I want to add, Anya, then this is a neighborhood, and I don't know if everybody know the Detroit and if you have been there, but this is one of the neighborhoods where 70% of the structure are gone. Mm-hmm. That means the neighborhood history have been lost through a lot of buildings who have been demolished by the city or by fire. And so the first time we went there, there is no light in the street. There is some emptiness in the building, and we start to talk with the residents who have not left the neighborhood, and you start to understand the whole story and how he was one of the cultural leader in Detroit, and it doesn't look like this anymore. And so it was really a challenge for us to figure out how you can start and uplift the narrative of all this history when you look at it and when you drive inside this neighborhood, you cannot see that anymore. And how the design, urban design, could help to bring this narrative outside. So that was really a surprising and astonishing space for us to learn.
So we started by building ginormous models. This is a clip from a 36-foot model that we built so that people could begin to relate their stories and narratives and their cultural imaginaries. People were able to point to particular lots in the neighborhood and tell us exactly what used to be there. And this was a working document for us to imagine and understand the value of continuous and engaged cultural heritage in the neighborhood. So if we move to the next slide, as a consequence, we ended up building a mobile DJ booth and space capsule, because we had learned so much about the value of music and music culture in the neighborhood, specifically having to do with the birth of funk music. And as a tribute to Parliament Funkadelic and George Clinton, who had transformed into a major cultural figure in this neighborhood, we decided to render that story explicit by creating a very lightweight, mobile, easy to transport artifact where DJs and performers could stage their own narratives and recount their own histories. And if we move to the next slide, Ishan. Okay. And then the title of this project, which was for us, even though it's a series of interventions, we thought about this really as an urban guiding plan. We called the project 1 Mile, and this was a riff on the idea that before 8 Mile, there was an origin story to music in the city of Detroit. And then we called it 1 Mile also because of the Oakland North End mile, which was literally the dimensions of the intervention, of the urban intervention.
So you see like as described, this is a neighborhood who has been collapsing, and 70% of the buildings are gone. There is no cultural structure, even if this is one of the most historic neighborhoods in Detroit. So the goal for us was, at the launch of the mothership, is to invite musicians who play with George Clinton, P-Funk, and do an event, almost an underground event. So there was no public invitation. It was really try to have the neighborhood and people who knows the history to come over. And there was one night we launched the mothership, and it was like maybe 400 people who came. And of course, it was a very successful launch for this project.
And again, as a prototype for cultural infrastructure, and as we move to the next slide, the idea was that this artifact could illustrate that, number one, there was talent, and that talent was continuous, and that there was cultural production that had not moved out of the neighborhood despite the aggressive blight remediation from the part of the city. And also that there was an audience for this kind of activity and for the cultural infrastructure that was possible there. So for us, this is a lightweight attempt to illustrate the need, the possibility, and the capacity for a particular site and a particular neighborhood to sponsor the activities that we have a hunch are the emergent programs of a particular site or space or neighborhood. So the mothership was designed to be lightweight and to be able to host a plethora of cultural activities and to move between vacant sites, different architectural scenarios, but activate a plethora of spaces using a minimal amount of means. And if we move to the next slide and launch the video, we can talk over that. Oh, thank you. So this is a video of the garage where the mothership lived for some time. The original plan was for it to be there for about 6 months, and ultimately it lived in this garage for 4 years. Do you want to talk about what we're seeing here?
So it's very important to describe how the mothership could be open and could have a DJ inside. So that's on this event. It was a band of ladies, led and curated by Emily Rogers. She's the bass player. She's close to the mothership. You can see her, and she's a very important figure in Detroit in the scene of hip hop and heavy metal as well. And she touched a lot of style of music, and all those performers are all from Detroit, and they play everywhere in the US. Like people in Detroit, musicians say there is no music performance in the US where there is no one musician from Detroit. And so that was the example of performance underground as well, but as a proof of concept, then if you have a cultural center in this neighborhood, it will work pretty well.
So if we move to the next slide, Ishan. I'm doing the thing that I promised I would never do, use the word next slide. I'm sorry.
We can do that in French. Prochaine.
Yeah. So in this series of parallel institutions, the one that you're all that you're using as your backdrop is the Nomadic Cultural Council Arch that we designed with input from many artists and activists in Detroit who were lamenting the closure and loss of an arts council in Detroit. The Arts Council was closed even before the city's bankruptcy. And even though the city really instrumentalizes its culture and art practices in order to envision an equitable regeneration of neighborhoods, artists very much felt underrepresented and undersupported in Detroit because there was no officialized government entity to support their efforts. And so this clip-on arch was designed to ephemerally, temporarily transform underused spaces into glitzy, vanguard spaces of cultural attraction, but also to legitimize and to draw attention to a cause. We go to the next slide. So here we are back at the garage, and this time we're testing how the clip-on ephemeral nomadic arch for the Cultural Council could possibly work, and what kind of conversations, events, and publics it can draw, and what kind of attention it can draw to the matter. So the way that we build these structures is extremely lightweight and, again, economical in every way. We try to make these artifacts look as, let's say, important or blingy as possible, but in essence, we're looking at something that is replicable for under $200 from a mold that we built in our barn and in our garage, and we're just using plastic painted with gold sheen to create the artifice of a truly permanent cultural infrastructure. So here we are. All of the pieces that we put together in these installations are typically the scale of a flatbed truck, so that we can move them around neighborhoods and attach them to various buildings. It's the same case for the mothership. Every piece of the mothership is exactly the scale of our truck. And then we also would bring the furniture around in the same truck in order to host these events. And so once you clip on the arch and you clip on and you begin to furnish and cultivate the possibilities of a particular place, people come together, conversations are kindled, attention begins to be paid to a particular aspect of community need, and the instigation for action takes place there. Do you want to add anything to this project?
I want to say there is a part of our work, and we will probably talk about that a little bit later on in this presentation, but Detroit is an African-American city with 85% of African-American, and we have been very working precisely to try to have the most diverse kind of audience. And you can see in this image, and you have seen that in the image before, is like the challenge to include everybody, and has been a very large part of our work. And the more we work in Detroit, and more he has been the driver and the challenge in the same way for us to get this this audience as diverse as possible.
So we're continuing to build these parallel cultural institutions, even despite our disembodied situation currently. So this is an example of Acts of Urbanism, which is an ephemeral cultural institution that's digital at this point, that brings together artists from Detroit, Grenoble in France, and Saint-Étienne to be able to collaborate on producing a more nuanced understanding of urban conditions that move beyond simply a kind of demographic analysis of a context, but begin to insinuate that through arts, culture, and collective production in the urban realm, we might get to a finer grain of an understanding of capacity, need, and cultural scenario building. So we're going to unpack the tools of our trade as we move to the next slide. So we wanted to share a little bit about how we produce these projects and what are the tools that we turn to in order to solicit broad engagement. So as we move to the next slide, we shape many of our projects, or we begin to shape our projects through events and programming. This is a scenography from the Detroit Funkestra, which was an open air opera staged in the middle of the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm. And here it's transported to the Saint-Étienne Biennale. If we move to the next slide, this is an image of a fragment of that scenography. And in many ways, it's a kind of hauntological project. In other words, that we're citing a number of vanguard cultural institutions that are disappearing in the North End or have disappeared. And we're literally picking the color and the shapes from those spaces and hybridizing them to create a new scenographic construct. Whether someone understands where those signifiers come from is less important than that it feels pertinent and bound to a sense of place. So it's not a direct translation, it's a kind of homage or a distanced citation of an original signifier. So with these kind of scenographies, if we go to the next slide, we again engage with artists, performers in a particular context to animate and to recount narratives that the architectural object in and of itself is incapable of doing. Next.
So from the design point of view, of course, so we have always very strong influence about this feeling of a 2D flat image. Then you turn it around and you become a 3D. That's a very important part of our work. The structural prowess, I don't know if I can use that in English, prowess, but is always a part of the discussion and conversation with all the students in architecture. That means we are always pushing the boundary of structure and with the cheapest material possible, because the stage and those events are not done to last forever, but they need to have an effect and a narrative very powerful. So that's very always interesting for everybody on all the team on the construction, how to reach the most important effects, so the discussion and the image could be the most powerful for everybody.
And so these kinds of events, they translate for us into a desire to produce more long-term, more stable cultural infrastructure. And so we're making a case that it's possible and that the network of people is there. For example, the Funkestra Opera was staged at the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm. And this is a model of that project, which is a 6-acre urban commons in the same neighborhood that we had been working in for some years. And it's the first land trust in Detroit, which is a great surprise to us, but also a phenomenal accomplishment of being able to bring so many people together with common ideological goals in order to secure a public or a public-facing landscape that can be preserved in the middle of the neighborhood. When we create these projects, which are very slow cooked, we also explore the possibility of broader engagement when they're revealed. So if we go to the next image. So this project, the Civic Commons, is also known as the Detroit Cultivator Project. And it had a big ambition to become sustainable ecologically, economically, and culturally. And for that, we really turned to understanding how speculation works in Detroit, imitating some of the processes by which speculators acquire land, working with a collective of urban advocates, social entrepreneurs, farmers, and others in order to purchase slowly but surely the 6 acres and to gift them to the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, and then to transform them into a land trust. And if we can move on. This is really the work that Jean-Louis has been doing very closely. So if you're interested in urban farming, he's really the person who has the greatest level of expertise. This project attempted to reimagine all of the vacant architecture on site and give it new meaning, give it new possibility in order to support the farming and the food production, which economically is very difficult to render sustainable.
I'd like to add the time for those kind of projects. Like there is a, I don't know if I can use the word evolution between when we start 10 years ago in Detroit and the last few years, because interest in land and structure in the city of Detroit has been more intense. And the farm used to grow food give access to fresh food for the residents of the neighborhood. But most of the land was owned by the city of Detroit. And so there was a lot of speculation. So slowly we worked together with the farm to design a master plan and try to have a very strategic way to acquire and have the farm become the owner of the land. And to protect this land, this is how we came up with this option. Then land trust is the most important part against gentrification or displacement. So this is a work in progress. We work very intensely about that. Like Anya said, the farm is the owner of 6 acres. Most of the land is transferred in the land trust. Nobody can never sell it anymore. It's going to be protected for the new generation, and it's going to be green space for most of it.
So this kind of planning, the behind the scenes planning, just to launch the project, we're talking about a couple of years of just strategic organizing in order to get to a point where this can become public knowledge. Because there is a fear that others might begin to purchase and speculate on land in order to flip it and to turn a profit. So again, returning to this idea of why create events, why worry about programming. If we go to the next slide, when it is time to render explicit what the strategy has been of a collective organization, the next step is to bring others into conversation with that effort in order not to create a feudalist system that's embedded within a larger urban fabric, but to invite others to begin to inflect and shape that project. So this is an image from an event that we staged called Prop Up, which invited neighborhood residents, foundations, artists, activists, and others to interact with the work that had been done so far, and then to invite others to participate in the project. And so as we can move through these slides, Ishan, quite quickly, inviting chefs, and artists to do installations, and feedback around the model and the scale of the intervention, introducing the drawings, the drawing set, and the possibilities of how the existing buildings could be reimagined. And again, always turning to performance and to exuberance as a way to counter some of the economic difficulties of place. And then if we just go to the video, and again, using performance art, inviting agriculture or farmers to work in collaboration with performance artists and social entrepreneurs. Here we're seeing this tiny video that we shot with the cell phone of 3 types of people engaging together in the creation of instruments made out of agricultural tools in order to launch a performance art piece in one of the buildings that's adjacent to the site, and just sort of illustrating that we can begin to blur disciplinary lines in order to imagine possible collective futures. So how do we tell all of these stories? If we go to the next slide. One thing that we turn to is broadcast. So we make objects that tell stories or that work as scenography so that others can tell stories. But then we also publish those stories, or we self-publish those stories in blingy magazines in ways that we can both narrate existing conditions and future possibilities. Next slide. And so over the years, we've produced lots of different publications. And these publications have always attempted to side with the sensibilities of, say, a September issue of Vogue. Like, we try to use very shiny paper. We incorporate lots of faux advertising. So, for example, businesses in the community might have advertising for efforts that are not quite fully formed, but it allows, again, the possibility of having small businesses appear more finished or more installed than they really are. So we combine narratives about contemporary moments, about the reality of place, with narratives that are future forward, that look at the way people would like to imagine their neighborhoods. Anything else about publication, Jean-Louis? No, okay.
Well, I have a background as a photographer, so a lot of images are part of my work, as well as the design with Anya.
So we think about these interventions as self-proliferating photomatons. So it's like, if you create an object that people would like to disseminate themselves with, then you begin to replicate stories about the intersection between architecture and its juxtaposition to a particular context. So we've tested this in a variety of ways. This is an installation in Hollywood at the Wuho Gallery on Hollywood Boulevard, where we thrust, this is also a project with Stephen Christensen, an early project, where we thrust a star through a series of very inexpensive slices of wood to see whether we could draw greater attention to an architecture gallery that seemed overlooked given the context, the gaudy context of Hollywood. And if we go to the next slide, this is an image of what the exterior of that building looks like. So lodged between a smoke shop and another smoke shop, I think, really quite difficult to view. But these inexpensive interventions begin to suggest that we can visibilize spaces that are vernacular or overlooked simply by using graphic POW. So if we look to the next slide, what we simply invited people to do was to occupy the space, and consequently, they created images of themselves in that space and began to disseminate them profusely through social media. And we were able to test and track what that kind of graphic intervention can produce. So another technique or another tool that we use is the creation of urban markers. Again, very inexpensive moves where if there is a site that wants to announce its future possibilities, we work carefully to produce an artifact that can show its spatial capacities and spatial possibilities. So we worked in Anya, France, at Les Tanneries, an abandoned tannery factory, to create an intervention to show the spatial possibility of a factory or a space come undone. So working there, we decided to build 2 vernacular stars in situ using stick construction, essentially, and to illustrate how the grace of the open space might be conserved for a plethora of uses. If we go to the next slide, we'll see those 2 stars, the protagonists in this play, hovering over the tannery tanks and also occupying the beams. But one of the roles, one of the features of creating these kinds of urban markers, first they announce to people in neighborhoods or in particular contexts that something is changing, that there's an opportunity to reimagine the spatial capacities of a site. But it also creates a graphic identity that can then be disseminated to tell the story of the place. So as we go to the next slide, we think of those graphic identities both as disseminating the story, but also testing or creating empathy for a particular place. And it's another way for us to think about inexpensive ways of replicating a narrative, but also investing in the telling of the story in more traditional contexts. So this, for example, is a tactic that we used when we worked with the tannery that considered itself, not to say a grade B institution, but one that had a much smaller budget than, say, the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. We created tote bags that we then inserted into the Palais de Tokyo's gift shop. And Ishan, if you can point me to the bag with the star. Yeah, so you see our tote bag is a little bit shorter than the official tote bags at Palais de Tokyo, so we did make a mistake. But as soon as we put the tote bags into the Palais de Tokyo, which sold for €8, there was an extreme amount of excitement about this project that was in the margins of the Parisian area. So it's an hour and a half away from the Palais de Tokyo, but suddenly it was legitimated through its graphic relationship to a more institutionalized space.
I think there is a name in English, it's called guerrilla marketing.
Yeah, it's guerrilla marketing,
yeah.
Exactly. So we do this kind of, if we go to the tote, we do these kinds of acts of taking spaces or projects that normally might not make their way into a market economy and illustrating that they have capacity to play well with others. Next, please. And again, we look to emergent programs. In any context that we work, we believe that there is already an activity of value and consequence that's happening. And it's the role of the designer and the urbanist to figure out what that activity is and to roll it into and embed it into the project and to unify it with other uses and capacities of a site. So we're always looking to figure out first and foremost what is already happening there to ensure that it can be included. If we move on. So our mode of representation for us is another tool. When we draw these kinds of images, we're working very hard to make them as legible as possible. Our scale figures are all people who are involved in the projects. So there's nothing is innocent about the production of these kinds of images. The vegetation we draw from Henry Rousseau and from Miles Davis record albums. Again, a kind of hauntological need to make people feel that this could be familiar rather than simply professional. This is a section of Red's Jazz Shoeshine, for example, at the farm, one of the projects that are part of the Civic Commons. And the next section is the landing, which is a residential home that the farm is looking to refashion as a hostel for youth visiting the farm. And in all of these images, if you were to zoom in, for example, even the wallpaper is designed in collaboration with artists and people that are part of the project. And the artwork on the wall is also artwork that's being produced in the neighborhood. Again, attempting to make a case that this isn't a generic whitewashing of existing infrastructure, but that it can begin to house the specifics of activity. Next. And yeah, and this is the big box, the little big box store that's also part of the Civic Commons at the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm. So if we go to the next image, and again, with this question of representation and how we try to clarify and represent the projects that we do, Jean-Louis and I also wanted to share a little bit about how we fund this work, because it's playful, it's exuberant, and how do we do it? So partially, this is funded through, and significantly, this is funded through foundations. So this is work that aligns somewhat with instrumentalized art practices. It's also funded through socialist governments. So when we work in France, for example, that's a very different format. That's projects being funded through the cultural ministry. And we're also supported through educational institutions, through the academy. You know, the reason why we have the capacity to take some of the risks that we do is because ultimately the academy functions as a minor socialist regime in and of itself. It creates a safety blanket for experimentation. Okay, so the final chapter is, if we move forward, is can we scale this up? You know, these are exuberant micro experiments, but what next? You know, can this be this kind of attitude and these kinds of strategies, can they be attached or applied to an institution? Can they be applied even to an urban design project? And we'd like to make the case that yes, that it is possible, and it's even it produces certain productive effects. So if we move to the next slide. Most recently, about a year and a half ago now, we took part in a competition to reimagine how to connect the cultural district in Midtown Detroit. And we're looking at an 80-acre site. No, it's less than that. It's about a 70-acre site with 12 institutions, individual autonomous institutions, including the Detroit Institute of Art, the Detroit Public Library, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. There's a building that belongs to the University of Michigan, the Rackham Center. Wayne State University is there. So just a plethora of differently scaled institutions. And the competition called for a strategy to bring these actors and these spaces together and to unify them into a dynamic collective landscape. So we did something kind of unusual. And Ishan, if we could move on to the next slide. Rather than producing a strategy that was a formal strategy, we introduced a series of elements that could be negotiated between the partners. So we looked at the site and we suggested that perhaps a square, a pedestrian square, could begin to bind and lend legibility to the district. And then we introduced the idea of an axial band or a series of ephemeral plazas that could house large-scale activities at the center of that district. And we also began to think about how we would need to treat something that we considered the ecotone, or the space where water management and biodiversity, and a thickened ecological buffer could produce a differently scaled environment. And then we also imagined a necklace binding the ecotone together and creating smaller scale activities in the district. And of course, all of the health of this scheme with its elements would be contingent on how each institution plugged in. So we suggested that the team would be able to work with each institution in order to calibrate those elements to their personal needs, but also to plan forward and see how their architecture might connect to the guiding plan. And against all odds, this project was selected, which meant that it came with an extensive research and development and schematic design and engagement period, which we're in the midst of currently, meaning that we're working with each individual institution to figure out what they're willing to share, how they're envisioning collective governance, how they imagine sort of sharing in collective infrastructure, reimagining mobility, reimagining what parking might look like in a district, and then also projecting how each institution sees itself 5, 10 years down the road in order to ensure that this plan is as sustainable as possible and as equitable as possible, despite the various budgetary requirements and capacities of each institution. So if we move to the next slide. And so this is the, a drawing that keeps getting redrawn. It's very much a work in progress. It's literally, we pull and we push and we negotiate each piece of this plan. And it's been in progress now for a year. And I think, we're looking to get it to a place where everyone feels comfortable, probably before the end of the summer. But it's that kind of same networking and building of relationships and negotiations that the project instigates. So these are a few images of streets that are, and these are streets that are making space for pedestrian activity by virtue of moving automobiles off of the main streets. And Ishan, as we just moved quickly through these, we're creating that ecological buffer where wilderness can be reinserted into the urban realm, where the frame of the plan allows for programmatic spillage from the interior of the institutions into the exteriors, softening the thresholds between the institutions and the landscape, blurring the boundaries between architecture and landscape to the best of our ability, creating space for cultural expression that can be shifting and can be deliberated and governed with multiple entities producing the landscape. Imagining the way that commercial or cultural activity can be brought to the surface, brought to the edge of institutions that have up until now been sort of hermetically sealed. And even in Detroit, the Motor City, reimagining the arteries, slowing down traffic and even shutting down on occasion the traffic that pulsates through the city in order to make space for cultural events. And so, how do we do this? We use the same techniques and the same tools that we learned from our micro interventions. Our office is a storefront that invites activity from the street and hosts a plethora of different animated programs in order to engage the broadest number of constituents. If we go to the next image, invite people in from different organizations and groups to intervene and to give us their feedback and to ensure that there are as many voices in a project like this as possible. Ishan, if we move forward. Okay, so yeah, the model, we can keep going. Yeah. Okay, so how does that work again during this difficult time of COVID? We work by creating an online presence that begins or attempts to simulate some of our physical activities in digital space. So again, this is the little blue box, shows a digital model that we built that works like Bing. Where we're using it as a pinup board to invite people to be able to click through the project in progress, which is very unusual, to be able to cultivate conversations between all of the stakeholders to ensure that everyone feels that it's transparent and that they're represented and that they can keep up with the conversations as they're taking place. We also are working to host events. Maria was part of one of them, which was amazing. And again, inviting conversations between different actors in the city in order to get the maximum amount of feedback and to ensure that there's a cultural line that creates the sensibility and the idiosyncratic aspects of place. And so we've learned quite a few lessons from our micro interventions, and we take them very seriously. And as if we were to talk to you as our early designers, those micro projects that were built on a shoestring, they have in many ways influenced the way that we think about broader projects in the urban realm. Jean-Louis, I'm sorry. Through that.
I didn't want to stop you. You were ready like to work.
Oh my God, we're chatty patty, and now that we run out of time, we need to talk to.
Oh, that's great.
Okay,
it's a
great.
Good description of our work. And is it the last image?
If you want.
No, I don't know. We have more. We have been busy. Huh? Yeah. Okay, so. There is a time now for a question, or how you want to do that?
I think so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening to all of that.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Anya and Jean-Louis, for your fabulous lecture. It was super inspiring, and also thanks for the amazing visual effect of slides. It is always fascinating to see like how those abandoned factories and spaces turn into efficient and elegant usable zones. And it was awesome to know the methods preserving the culture with ephemeral instruments. And I would like to read the landscape and its ephemeral installations and the great combination of the field of architecture and the fine arts. I don't know if I can see tools act as a catalyst of the vitality of these projects and also urban vitality, because they are so efficient. And I am appealed by the elegance of your projects. They are so beautiful. So would you like to talk more about if there is a general method of how you found those cultural factors and how to convert them into your design, like the visual appearance and of the installations and their functions?
Wow. Thank you so much for that. First, thank you for calling it elegant. That's really spectacular.
That's great. Yeah.
That's great. Jean-Louis is going to be very delighted.
I love the word elegance.
Yeah, I guess, elegance. My grandfather always said that if you have one pair of pants, you best be sure that you iron the crease into them with extreme formalist attention. And I think that in many ways, that's been our attitude, that if you have meager means, you have to use everything with extreme attention to its outcome. So despite the fact that, the first projects that we showed, very few of them bypassed the $2,000 mark in terms of material. I mean, the labor was huge, but the materials, we never got past 2000 for the first few years. So for us, it was always about, in terms of the aesthetics, it was always a strategy of how to make the materials that we had at hand look as sophisticated and as posh as possible, to contrast the predicament of meager investment in the public realm. So we paid a lot of attention to that. If you noticed, you know, we try to veer away from any of the tropes of social impact design. So we don't use crates, or what is it, pallets, you know, like we don't use pallets in architecture. We veer away from using, God, I forgot this word too, like those metal bins, Jean-Louis, oh God, that everyone, container, you know, like
container, yeah, we don't want to use the container, yeah.
We don't believe in the container architecture movement,
right.
Both for the fact it's unsustainable, but also for the signification of its failures as an industrial trade. Like, so we pay extreme attention to the symbolic value of the materials that we use, and we try to elevate them as much as possible.
And I want to add that there is a desire, how I say that, to have respect of the people we work with who live in the situation who is collapsing. And when you have seen your history, heritage gone the last 30, 40 years, the last thing you want to do is to bring another layers of non-design and unpleasant perspective. So that it has been always very important for us to uplift the design for everyone, feel as somebody look at this situation and somebody respect the people who live there. Always very important. The cost is the contrast between the context and the design also is very important. Of course, there is surprising when you see a piece of design and with gold when you are inside a collapsing building. There is some kind of provocation on that as well. So the image is very strong, and you can bring the attention of the collapsing of the system and the government. And the cost of it is true. The material are very basic, plywood, painting, and screw, very basic. But we have a very strong support, and Anya, because she teaches you of them, there is always a support of students working with us, and that's very important.
Thank you.
I also just want to thank you for such a great presentation. I think we all learned so much, and this was a really special presentation for all of us. I had a question for the both of you. After looking through all of your projects and also looking at them online, one of the comments that I heard from your project, and this was Oakland Farm, the urban farm in Oakland, was that you're not only cultivating produce in the farm, you're cultivating youth. And this seems like a recurring theme in many of your projects, especially in cases where you're working in post-industrial landscapes. But the idea of cultivating youth is something that you try to achieve in your project. So I would love to know more about how it came about and whether it is a design philosophy that you aspire to as a firm.
So should I answer, Anya? So this is really the work of the team at the farm. It's a group of women who really look at the food safety issue, the safety for the young people and everything in the neighborhood. And they are really the people who did work on this, bringing up all this program. We brought our knowledge and experience and excitement about urban design, but the roots and the base of the history of this project is really this group of women who took over this land and start to preserve it, to have a safety space in this neighborhood.
Thank you for your answer. I have another question that is sort of related to the nature of practice. So, like you mentioned, like a lot of your practice is funded by grants from institutions, and especially educational institutions like the University of Michigan is something you work closely with. I'm curious to know how this shift between research, design, construction, and publication, how these determine the nature of the process of design and the nature of output that you expect to create.
That's a great question, Sirota. Thank you for that. I would say we answered we suggested that the support from the different sources is sort of neutral, but it's not. So academic institutions not only encourage research and radical thinking about contexts, but they also produce a safety net with which more experimental projects might be able to work. So for example, we were able to work on some of our more radical projects because U of M can, or a university can offer insurance, for example, or offer certain professional services that we wouldn't have been able to afford as a freestanding, independent office, because the risks of some of this work is very high, you know. So it's not that everyone, that the resources aren't egalitarian from all sources, but they offer certain kinds of support that are beyond simply capital investment in these kinds of projects. And they also offer, you know, being connected to an institution offers a different way of participating in public discourse like we are now. So I think that's been very important for us, because it's not solely, we've been very, very committed to exploring how we can participate in public conversations with a plethora of actors, but also being able to think about those critically within an academic setting has proven important as well.
Thank you for your answer. And I'm sure the students are equally benefiting from your presence. And I imagine it would be amazing to be on one of your projects, and it's a really exciting learning experience. So I would like to, since we're almost at time, I would love to open it up for discussion and welcome anybody else who has questions to ask them. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you for your great presentation. I have one question here. I think all of your projects are really interesting and make me feel that it's wonderful to see how it works in the process. And my question is that in your different projects, is that and like scales from small to big, community is engaged in the process, and I want to know like how it works and what's the dynamic of it.
Shall I do? Where do you want?
Okay. All the design you see is the cherry on the cake. Most of the work is done on the cake. The network, the politics, the money is huge work to be able to have an image and to show you our design. And it's very important to understand that's the design is only the final piece, then we can talk about it. But in the last 10 years, there was an evolution the way you communicate, you engage community, you engage people. Is not easy at all, I would say, and is in this political context of this country today, there is a lot of challenge, and it's getting more difficult, and more, you need to be more careful and really engage the people, and try to be very, very open, because everybody express and have a different perspective, and is pretty complicated. So I always take the example of the iceberg, the design, or the cherry on the cake. The design is only the outside of the iceberg, but the work underneath is really the most important part, and very complex.
And if I could just add one thing to this response is, when you ask the question, which I really appreciate, which is how do you work with community? I would also venture to say that the first step is by understanding and redefining and translating what we mean by community. And in our practice, we understand it as something that coexists on a number of levels. So certainly a community is a place and a geography and a group of people that relate to that place. But for us, it's also an ideological community. So we might all have something that we agree on or want to work on together, even if we come from different places. And then there's also simultaneously the idea of an ephemeral community, that if we stage an event for a split moment, for a brief moment, we can coexist in a non-essentialist, pluralistic way. And that also proves that a community is possible. So for us, we try to always think about those three levels simultaneously, and see how we might stitch together those very, very, very different needs and interests.
Yeah, thank you. It's really helpful to know this.
Now we'll take a question from Veena. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing to see like the scale of community engagement and methods of communities engagement within your work, like from art installations to urban design. And I think it was wonderful to see how each of the projects are a celebration of the community. But I was wondering, like, were there any moments where, like, there were tensions between the communities or the local residents that you were working with, and how did you deal with those moments and have the negotiations?
Mm-hmm. So, Jean-Louis, you or me? We obviously have a lot to say. This is a great question.
Please, Anya. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to address, thank you. Our practice operates in a post-democratic space. So we're attempting to emulate some of the activities that might be associated with, say, a cultural ministry, should that funding be available in a different political context. But we're working in a space where so much of the funding comes from private enterprise in the form of foundation grants. And that investment is not voted upon or decided by a collective. It's determined by an entity with their own mission and their own interests and ideological bends. And that flux of capital, however small, is not neutral. So that is just the one of the catalysts and instigations for so much complex, conflict-driven scenarios in work with others, because there's always the question of who gets access to foundation funding, which foundations have the right to inflect the space, the collective space of a community, and what are the ultimate impacts of that investment that isn't made through a government entity or a democratic process. So in other words, in many ways, community engagement is the aftermath of post-democracy, and that's, so what should we do? Should we not work given this situation? Should we work cautiously? Should we build broader networks of people to co-govern? I think, these are all complex questions that are consistently in play.
Thank you so much for that.
And Professor El-Khafi, we'd love to hear your question next.
Thank you, Samrita. First of all, I'm just sneaking in because I have a question that is basically goes a little bit deeper to some of the answers that you provided. First of all, thank you so much. This was really a fantastic presentation, extremely rich projects. I'm extremely impressed by the way how you're creating all of the different aspects that are making the cultural common, and how you do this as a designer by also avoiding that it's perceived as a top-down strategy. And I'm wondering a little bit, because the design of the common is something that students are at the moment extremely invested in, not only in the context of building communities and the cultural aspects of a city, but also in relationship to resilience, how to protect from the water, how to preserve land. And the common comes up again and again as this negotiator between governments that are failing, basically, the danger of land being taken over by corporates, and the community being, as individuals, too weak to act, but the hope that we can all act together in the common. So the design of the common, I think, is a super important topic, and students are trying to get head around it. My question is, I have the feeling that you are obviously extremely successful doing this, and I was trying to extract some really lessons learned that has something to do with scale, that the things that you're designing, the stage that you're designing, has design components in it, but they are actually small, because if they probably would be too large, it might be perceived as a top-down. It's an open stage where actors can come in and out. It is something that where you collaborate with other artists and actors to make it a diverse stage. So it's extremely sensitive how you are creating this environment. And I'm interested, and also the way how you are telling the narrative is beautiful. The things of distributing the signs across the city, it seems random, but it's actually not, because it's slightly directed. It's beautiful. It's very poetic. And I'm wondering, and I don't want this to be the last question, but I'm assuming you also tried out strategies that might not have been so successful. So what did you learn from your failures, and what were failures, in case you had some of them? If you didn't, even better.
Lots of failures. This is natural. This is part of the life. It's normal. I think our greatest failures came from, I mean, like now we're just, I don't even know, we're just telling the truth, but came from an exuberance for collectivity in a place where we might not have understood that individualism reigned. I don't know how to put it a different way, but we also are clearly outsiders. We're outsiders to Detroit. We're outsiders to ourselves. But we assumed that certain ideological frameworks were shared in common with everyone. And they weren't, because people have different goals and different ideals. And we assumed, as having come from a particular place, for example, that collectivity was better than individualism in a place where modern capitalism had failed. Mm-hmm. But we didn't quite understand the level to which there was still hope and faith in the American dream and in the capacity for the individual to rise above the difficulties of a particular political and economic context. So I think we were in many ways naive about the taste or the aspiration or the appetite for working as a collective and for collective ownership over things. So we experienced that when there was an influx of capital, there was a lot of conflict over wanting individual ownership versus collective ownership. And that was a big surprise for us, because we thought we were all, like everyone involved was working toward similar goals and with similar aspirations. But those things are not necessarily true, and they need to be fleshed out. The things that are lost in translation, it's better to address them earlier rather than later, I would say. And we addressed them a little later because we made assumptions about the common good. And it's not necessarily good for all.
Thank you. That's a great example.
And I just want to add, I totally agree. And for us, it has been a revelation to understand that collective vision is very complicated today, and how deep neoliberalism and capitalism is part of the vision of the world, and how complicated it is to have alternative option. And I was really so it was not a failure. Like the land trust we work with, the farm has been an outcome of this understanding. Then if we preserve the land, speculation and grabbing land from everybody, we can stop it for a long time. So that was an evolution in this lack of understanding of this, and to have an outcome who actually is pretty powerful, to have the first land trust in the city of Detroit.
Thank you.
I'm gonna jump in to say thank you again, Anya, Jean-Louis. What a treat to have you here. What a treat to see, your collective work, but also your individual voices and, preoccupations and ways of working. I also want to thank the students for the incredible engagement and, the very thoughtful questions. And to everybody, maybe seeing us through YouTube, thank you too for joining us today. Thank you so much.
It's been a total pleasure. Thank you all.